I'm assuming we're up and ready to go. Welcome everyone to the Stop U.S. THAAD and War Threats in Korea webinar. My name is Ramsey Leem and I'll be serving as your moderator. I'm a member of the task force to stop THAAD in Korea and militarism in Asia and the Pacific, and also the Channing and Pope Lim Education Foundation. Both were sponsors of a recent Solidarity Peace delegation to South Korea that you're going to learn about. This evening's webinar is a chance for all of us to hear a report back from the delegates and their principal coordinator, Ju-Yeon Rhee, Reese Chenault, Will Griffin, Medea Benjamin, and Jill Stein. I'll introduce them in more detail in a moment before they speak. So thank you to the more than, probably by now, several hundred people who have been joining us this evening, and for your concern for helping to resolve 7 decades of unremitting hostility between the United States and North Korea. In the face of mounting threats and counter threats that could escalate into unimaginable nuclear warfare, including yesterday's missile test by North Korea in protest of current US-South Korea war games, more of the American public has taken notice and expressed concern. Hopefully they will become new allies to Korean American activists who have been largely lone voices calling for a negotiated past and present US conflicts with North Korea and respect for South Korean sovereignty. So the delegation you're going to hear from was organized as a follow-up to a national tour we hosted this spring for Reverend Sung-Hae Kim, a representative from the Citizens Coalition fighting the installation of THAAD in Seongju County, about 135 miles south of Seoul. Just a few days ago, they participated in their 365th protest rally, marking 1 year since the now deposed Park Geun-hye administration acceded to U.S. pressures to deploy the THAAD missile defense system in Korea. For those of you who are not familiar with THAAD, it's a missile defense system that the Pentagon claims will protect South Koreans and US military forces from North Korean attacks. However, missile systems experts say that THAAD has no defensive value for large areas of South Korea, including metropolitan Seoul, and may create significant health and environmental risks. In fact, its only value may be the capacity of its radar system to monitor missile installations in China and Russia. You'll hear more about THAAD and its controversy from our speakers. So here's our plan for this evening. Each person is going to talk for about 10 minutes, and that should leave us with about 20 minutes for questions and answers. For those of you who have logged in on your laptops, if you look at your screens at the top in the middle, you'll see a green icon with a question mark in the middle. As we're speaking and you're listening to our delegates, at any point you can submit a question to us. Just type it in using that icon, and we will do the best that we can to get to your questions at the conclusion of our last speaker's comments. Our tech administrator for this webinar is Sarah Sloan. She's an organizer for the anti-war group International Answer and a member of the task force to stop THAAD in Korea. I say this because I want to express my personal thanks to her and I say this with much forethought, for gently walking me through the intricacies of webinar technology, a great source of anxiety for me. Okay, so let's introduce our first speaker, Ju-Yeon Rhee. She's a first-generation Korean immigrant grassroots organizer whose work is focused on demilitarization, minority rights, and reunification and reconciliation in Korea. She's a steering committee member of the Task Force to Stop THAAD in Korea, a member of the Solidarity Committee for Democracy and Peace in Korea, and a leader in Notatal for Korean Community Development. She's also a board member of the Korea Policy Institute. Ju-Yeon has extensive knowledge of and connections with peace activists and progressive movement sectors in South Korea. And I can say this with full confidence. Without her participation, it would not have been possible to organize this delegation. She served as a delegation coordinator, but encountered pushback herself from South Korean authorities. She'll probably say a few words about this as she provides context for the issues of that our delegation addressed and an overview of the group's activities in Korea. So please welcome Ju-yeon.
Thank you, Ramsey. Hello, everyone. I have to say I am very honored to be a part of this presentation. It has been a great working with these wonderful and outstanding people, Reese, Will, Media, and Jill of this delegation. And it has been great, really great experience to work with Ramsey and Paul as a coordinating team. I guess I want to credit to Korean diaspora community, which has been involved in international solidarity for many long years, building connection, respect, trust, and understanding. Thanks, Ramsey and Paul. Paul Lim is also a member of STIC Task Force Steering Committee. He's an ED at Korea Policy Institute. Anyway, this delegation was able to draw from the rich history of Korean diaspora in the US and accumulated experience on international solidarity with Korea. And I'm very grateful about that. Because the THAAD system is a part of the first strike-driven US missile defense strategy and has a lot to do with America's pivot to Asia and the Pacific, trade war with China, war threats to North Korea, and enhanced military capabilities of Japan. The STIC task force has been trying to find ways to connect with other sectors of peace movement. So this Solidarity Peace Delegation was formed in hopes to raise awareness and deepen knowledge of US peace movement and the public about the THAAD deployment in Korea, US-Korea relations, and to build a broad opposition to further US militarism. When we began preparing it, the candlelight protests over 8 months, or the so-called candlelight revolution, had successfully and peacefully removed the Park Geun-hye regime. The daughter of infamous dictator Park Chung-hee, Park Geun-hye started her presidency with an election scandal, soon disbanded a progressive political party in Korea, overtly oppressed the labor unions and the progressives. So after the regime change, the Park Geun-hye was impeached and arrested. People were really hopeful for a better society with the newly elected liberal president, Moon Jae-in. But US-Korea relations were not changed and affected much. The aggressive military posture of the Trump administration remained the same. That the deployment was more pressured and emphasized. The sanctions and military threats toward North Korea got only enhanced and escalated. And with North Korea's tip for tat response, peace was further destabilized in the Korean Peninsula. I also discovered that Moon Jae-in and Park Geun-hye were not that different on that issue through my personal experience of being banned from entering South Korea with our delegation. To give you some background, last year, another member of our task force, Hyun Lee, and I found out that we were banned from entering South Korea at the Incheon airport. We were supposed to lead another peace delegation of a Bet for Peace to learn about the THAAD deployment and US military base issue. Great surprise, I found out I was still on the South Korean immigration office's blocked list when I attempted to fly to Korea with this summer's delegation. In spite of a widespread protest campaign of US and the international communities, I was not permitted entry. So by maintaining the ban of past administration, I guess Moon administration also thought it would be beneficial to keep anti-THAAD THAAD activists away from the Korean Peninsula. Thankfully, I have to say, the ban and my inability to travel to Korea delegation from carrying out our plans for solidarity building with our hosts in Seoul and Seongju. This delegation has fabulously accomplished all of our goals and worked so well before, during, and after the trip, not only with each other, but also with our Korean host committee, the National People's Action to Stop Deployment of THAAD in South Korea, known as NPA, a coalition of more than 100 civil society organizations. Actually, we worked not only with the people of the city where the THAAD system is being deployed, in other words, people of Seongju and Gimcheon, but also the NPA on the overall national campaign. Once in Korea, this delegation had a tightly packed schedule, numerous interviews with well-known newspapers and popular podcasts, meetings with the NPA steering committee, different labor, environment, and peace, anti-war, and reunification organizations, a visit to the National Assembly Hall, where they met with a representative, which would be a congressperson in the US setting, who belongs to a Foreign Affairs and Trade Committee, and had discussions on the THAAD deployment prospects for peace in Korean Peninsula. Of course, they also visited Seongju and Gimcheon and participated in a regular daily and weekly peace vigils, marched with the students and other peace activists calling for withdrawal of THAAD and peace in Korea. Because their trip overlapped with the Armistice Day, July 27, which is widely commemorated in a peace in the peace movement in South Korea, calling for peace treaty. They also participated in a peace treaty event in Seongju. Not only that, Jill broadcasted a Facebook Live from Seongju. We created several interviews and videos of delegates and villagers on YouTube channel. This group knew how to work with social media really well. For a short 6-day trip,
One more minute.
they managed to achieve two important points. One, they brought the perspective of the US peace movement to the Seongju village protesters. For example, the villagers used to say, 사드는 미국으로, 평화는 이 땅으로. Send the THAAD back to the US, bring peace to our land. After their meeting with our delegates, the villagers realized that THAAD is also deployed against the US citizens' wishes and demand for solving domestic needs rather than expanding US militarism abroad. Now the villagers' chants at their rallies have changed to 사드는 필요 없다, 온 세계의 평화를. THAAD is not needed anywhere, bring peace to the world. With the help of two wonderfully bilingual Korean-American activists, second point is working in South Korea, namely Wolsan and Hosu, the delegates were able to issue joint statements, had joint press conferences, and circulated joint petitions with their Korean counterparts. Sometimes due to language barriers and logistical difficulties, sometimes because of the different perspectives, and sometimes due to lack of organizational support, these joint efforts are not common in US-Korea solidarity works. All documents were reviewed by members of both sides beforehand, and the process was arduous and very fast-paced, but they managed it all. I think it was important accomplishment in Korea's international solidarity work. With the development of maybe internet communication apps, Telegram, WhatsApp, Facebook, and what have you, it is easy to communicate back and forth with and among all of the related parties in the US and in Korea. These joint efforts were possible because all showed willingness and flexibility to accommodate one another. I firmly believe that it will only get easier to work with one another as this practice continues, creating more meaningful and international solidarity with more common joint demands. Now, you will be hearing from each of our delegates. So I will wrap this up by stating, even after they came back, they didn't stop working on Korea peace issue. And I'm looking forward to working with them more side by side toward peace and reunification of Korea, Asia and the Pacific, and of this world at the end. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ju-Yeon. It's very clear that while they blocked you from coming into the country, they didn't block you from doing the incredible work that you've been doing actually for most of your life. Thanks very much. Before we move on to our next speaker, who will be Reese Chenault, we're going to show you a short video that Will Griffin made to give you a sort of visual feel for what it was like for the delegates to be in South Korea. Sarah, if you could put that up.
우리 소송위의 엄마들이나 할머니들은 결단코 이 사드를 막는데 온 힘을 쏟고 있습니다.
사드 같은 것들이 한국에 있어야 우리를 지킬 수 있는 게 아닌가 하고 생각할 수도 있겠지만 관심을 가진 다음 화면에 이런 식의 것들이 더 북한과 중국과 러시아를 자극하고 동아시아와 미국의 안전을 더 위협한다라는 것을 알 수 있을 것 같고
자들도 이거 안 놀랍해. 이거 사드 엄마 몰라보고 막 공기 나쁘고 사드가 우리를 보호해. 보호 안 하지. 사드 엄마 우리는 정의라고 그러거든.
우리도 아이들이 있고 사드 저는 굉장히 궁금한 게 사드는 위험하지 않다라고 하는데 정말 위험하지 않은 건지 실험을 하지 않고 지금 최초잖아요. 사람들이 사는 임금의 최초이기 때문에 저희는 믿을 수 없고 그 부분에 대해서 어떻게 생각을 하는지 사업 때문에 무조건 배치를 하는 게 맞는 건지
어머니로서 여성으로서 당신의 자식을 생각을 하고 당신의 또 손녀, 손자들을 생각을 한다면은 나는 무기를 만드는 일을 당장 그만둬야 된다고 생각합니다.
회장님 사드 만들어서 한국인 보내주지 마이소.
So it gives you some sense of some of the people that the delegates met and how they're looking at these issues. So for more insight, let me introduce our next speaker, Reese Chenault. Reese has spent almost 14 years as a union and community organizer and currently serves as national coordinator for U.S. Labor Against the War, an anti-war organization dedicated to changing the labor movement's foreign policy from within. Reese has also been a community organizer with One DC that promotes racial and economic equity and political power in the Washington, D.C. area, a coordinator with the Restaurant Opportunity Center of New Orleans, and a member strength organizer for SEIU Local 500, focusing on the Montgomery County Public School employees. He's currently on the board of directors for the National Black Workers Center Project and also edits a blog where he talks about mental health and organizing as a person of color. He's one of the first U.S. labor organizers to visit South Korea for the explicit purpose of building ties with Korean workers fighting militarism in their country. Thanks very much for being with us, Reese, and I look forward to your comments. Reese, are you able to join us?
Sorry, I was on mute. Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's great. Could you turn your camera on as well?
Sorry.
Thank you.
Okay. Sorry about that. So I figured I'd start with a blurb that I had the opportunity to present while I was in South Korea. And I think it really sums up a great deal of what I wanted to accomplish in terms of communication, but also just a sense of what we're working on. So I need folks to imagine a burning house. Workers in the US who make weapons of war have actually communicated to our organization that they often are left with the choice of supporting destructive systems or poverty. And elected officials communicate the same, telling us that they are made to fund these projects because if they don't, they'll be faced with the same choice. A cycle is then perpetuated by unwilling participants who often feel that they have been locked into a burning house, unable to escape. THAAD then, for US workers, really represents a reinvestment in a declining industry that we can't afford. So prior to the trip to Korea, I spent a good amount of time with some friends who were from South Korea about what they saw in the place that they recognized as part of them. And from those conversations, I really wanted to wrap the expectations of my organizations around some admittedly murky ideas about where I was going to be. I mention this because I want it to be clear that labor in the US, particularly in this period, has a lot of growing to do. And it's actually really difficult because this growth has to happen under the harsh light of a social justice movement moment that is really critical of the role that labor has played here over the years. And I don't want to wander too far into the weeds on this, but just for clarity's sake, I really want to say this. The labor movement hasn't really moved with new currents and has mostly been unresponsive to calls for racial and climate justice until very recently. Foreign policy is really no different in terms of this stagnation. The AFL-CIO, after all, for a long time had the nickname the AFL-CIA. So when I'm being sent to South Korea, representing an organization built on a labor movement with, to be polite about it, a complicated history with progressive movements, I needed to be clear, not just with my organization, but also with myself about where we could take the work moving forward. In terms of foreign policy, the stagnation's a really thorny issue that came up during the trip multiple times. At various points, I was asked questions about labor's role in the election of Trump, how we imagined our relationship with North Korean trade unionists could be shaped, and what the future of this new relationship with South Korean trade unionists would be, especially framed around the North Korean trade unionist question. I don't think these questions were hostile. I think there was honest curiosity about where US labor unions are in the fight to demilitarize our own economy. And my answer had to be honest. This is really slow moving, but it's moving. The president's really galvanized our movement to be differently faced, both externally, and I think about the relationship between unions, particularly union members, and the movement for Black Lives as an example of that, but also internally. Union leaders are making new decisions about their involvement with us as an organization because the new climate requires more information about countries like North and South Korea. We had one full day to connect with folks in KCTU leadership and talk to the unification department. And those meetings were really tough, but they were great. And I say that they were tough because I wasn't completely sure what commitments I could make about issues like North Korea trade unionists and further involvement with American trade unions in discussions with those folks. My membership before I left was understandably a little wary about getting near that situation. I needed a clear way to have a conversation without drawing the wrath of an administration already hostile to labor. But once I had a chance to really sit down with folks, it was actually clear that there were inroads that, with some negotiation and a little bit of elbow grease, could actually make something possible that only 4 days prior had actually seemed impossible. I appreciated the candor and the thoroughness of my comrades in the KCTU, and in the end, I think folks left knowing that we were committed to being better allies in the struggle. For obvious reasons, that was the day I was really the most excited about, and I came away with a few thoughts about how we could be in each other's lives organizationally in the future. The first was one that had been developing literally while I was asleep in Korea. Because of the time difference, most of my conversations with union folks were at night or really early in the morning. They were endlessly curious. While they were asleep, I was having these experiences, but while I was sleeping, folks were talking about the trip. The blog that I had started had been passed around, and excitement was building. Before I left, we talked vaguely about me sharing experiences in a presentation or some kind of video. But by the time the trip was over, it was pretty clear that a first step would be to spend some time in different places across the country talking about the trip. In fact, during a meeting with folks in Songju, I made that commitment to them, and I plan to keep it. In New York on September 23rd, I'll be participating in a fundraising event centered around a report back to labor folks about my experiences. And we've got some labor leaders who have already committed to show up. It's going to be pretty great. And it'll be my first real chance to try out the story I want to tell, but also to make a pitch for folks to get more involved and really think about how they want to develop and shape this relationship with South Korean folks. The second was also a commitment I made in Songju, but it was one that didn't really become real until that last day with leadership. I knew even before the trip that our work on a campaign to connect workers that are locked into the military industrial complex would be a subject of rich debate. Excuse me. When I made that first statement that I presented in the beginning, I got plenty of quizzical looks from folks, including my fellow delegates. Excuse me. There's a wide assumption that workers are willing participants in this massive destructive machine of military industrial complex. And I wanted my contribution to partly be a dismantling of that image. Therefore, the logical next step seemed to be closing the gap between workers in that industry and the people that their products affect. And to do that, we need to produce a delegation of folks from different parts of the labor movement. I respectfully asked the workers in Songju if I could bring some of those people to visit with them, and I received a positive response. So now I've started to work on building that committee. We anticipate that it's probably going to take about a year to find, politically educate, and logistically prepare folks to actually be a part of a trip like this. This is producing a great deal of excitement with younger workers who had taken a look at some of the pictures and have been really excited to see so many pictures of young and involved, motivated folks. So I anticipate that this is going to be a pretty wildly diverse group full of energy and fire when and if we can pull it off. So in closing, I had a recent meeting with a young guy in Louisville, Kentucky, and we were talking about just about travel in general. I had planned on asking him if he wanted to be a part of this group that would look into being a delegation, but I wasn't necessarily prepared to start into that conversation with him. But what was interesting was that he actually informed me that he'd never been out of the country before. And so if we were going to do a trip like this, this would be the first time that he ever left the country to go anywhere. And the first place that he would go would be to meet his comrades in South Korea. For me, it was a really powerful moment. And it kind of showed me the power of solidarity and what can move and drive people to do something amazing. And it was a lot of fun to actually ask him if he wanted to be a part of the tour and see the stunned look on his face as he really wrestled with the fact that he was being asked to go to all places the first time, go to Korea. So this is a longer work for us. Some of these goals are pretty medium term, long term, but it's exciting for us to be able to make that connection and build the bonds of solidarity with new folks. I think it's, looking back, I couldn't have thought that I would be talking about the things that I'm talking about in terms of connecting with North Korean trade unionists maybe a month ago. But here we are having that conversation. So I want to thank Ramsey, Julian, and my brothers and sisters that were part of the delegation. It was an incredible experience. And I'm happy that I get to share that experience with you folks. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Reese. You know, it's the first time I had a chance to hear a little bit about your experience. But I had heard from people in Korea that they were really excited to meet you and to see the possibility for talking together about next steps. And it sounds like at least you have some thoughts about that and maybe some plans in the works. I have a feeling that down the road, you'll be able to bring in a whole new sector of people here in the States and also in Korea to find ways to work together on common interests. Thanks again, Reese.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to move on to our next speaker. Before I do that, I just want to remind people who are listening that if you have questions for our presenters, just use that green icon at the top middle of your screen and type in a question, and we'll try to get to it during our Q&A. Our next speaker is Will Griffin. Will is a former U.S. Army paratrooper who deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. He's currently on the board of directors for Veterans for Peace and the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. He's also a member of the steering committee of our task force to stop THAAD in Korea. He's the creator of the Peace Report, a social media organization focused on anti-war media for peace and justice. And he's participated in many solidarity actions, including the protests at the Dakota Access Pipeline at Standing Rock and demonstrations at the U.S. and South Korean Naval Base in Jeju Island and U.S. installations on Okinawa. In fact, he's perhaps going back to Okinawa later this year with another delegation. Will was, among other things, a documentarian on our delegation, as you can tell from the video that we just saw, and other materials which he may be able to share with you. So welcome, Will, and looking forward to hearing what you have to tell us.
All right, thanks, Ramsey, and thanks everybody for joining us. I only have 10 minutes, so I'm going to try to just go over three main things. Just reminding people of what the Asia pivot is, describing the issues surrounding THAAD, and then maybe ending off with a little bit of Korean history, which kind of sums up our whole entire delegation there. We wanted to focus on Asia, especially Korea. That's a hot spot right now. And originally kind of going there to shine light on the THAAD issue, but coming back and realizing that it's a regional issue and it's a lot more than that, even though THAAD is still important. Okay, the Asia pivot, just to remind folks, was an announcement by Obama in 2011. And since then, the U.S. military shifted 60% of its naval forces towards the Asia Pacific. They've been building up bases. They've been sending more military equipment to the region and focusing it there. And I believe the Asia pivot will be in U.S. foreign policy probably for the next few decades. And that's in THAAD is, certainly part of this pivot to Asia. And they're trying to rename the pivot to the rebalance of Asia, or the Asia rebalance, but it's all the same thing: military buildup to show U.S. domination and regional control in the area. Okay, so THAAD, it can be a little bit complicated, but just know that it is what's called a missile defense system. Even though I don't think it's defense, it's more offense, and it's part of a multi-layered system that is destabilizing, doesn't work, and costs a lot of money. Those are the things you should take after me explaining some of the complex issues about this. But essentially, THAAD is spelled THAAD. It stands for Terminal High Altitude Area Defense. It is a system, two parts of which are controversial. The first one is the actual interceptor missile, and the second part is the radar. The missiles, the interceptor missile, is literally just shooting a chunk of metal towards another incoming missile. So say if North Korea or China or whoever wants to shoot a warhead, you shoot this anti-missile or missile defense system at it, and it should knock down the incoming threat missile. And the radar is controversial because the radar encompasses over much of China and parts of Russia. and that's a direct threat to their national security. Like I said, that is part of a multi-layer defense system. It's integrated with the LSAM missiles, the PAC-2 and PAC-3 missiles, and now the THAAD missile. And THAAD, like I said, stands for high altitude, meaning that it's only meant to shoot down missiles above, say, 45 kilometers or higher, right? And the problem with this is, why would North Korea, in order to shoot a missile at South Korea? So first off, they say THAAD is there to protect South Korea from incoming missiles from North Korea. If North Korea wanted to shoot a missile to South Korea, why would it have to shoot at a high altitude or a long range missile? It's sharing a border with South Korea and can easily shoot a short range missile below 45 kilometers. And for it to shoot anything above 45 kilometers doesn't make any sense. Try to hit a target that's just right next to you. And THAAD hasn't been proven to work under real world conditions. They come out with these tests saying that it's 100% successful, but these tests have been scrutinized and they don't play out in a real world condition. And overall, for missile defense systems overall, which are controlled through an agency called the Missile Defense Agency, which published a report earlier this year that said, overall, all systems together have a 56% failure rate. So we're spending billions and billions of dollars on these missile defense systems for something that has less than a 50% success rate. Not to mention, another way to overcome missile defense systems is to make what's called missile decoys. So say that THAAD is trying to shoot down one missile, but what if the North Koreans or whoever the threat is shooting multiple missiles, say hundreds, and only 2 of them are real? THAAD has no way of detecting which the real one is. And the US will only have 48 interceptor missiles in South Korea. And anybody else, North Korea, China, or whoever, can easily create hundreds of missile decoys for a very small amount of money compared to an actual warhead. And these missile defense systems cannot detect which missiles are real and which missiles have the actual warheads in them. And just to remind people, missile defense systems were actually illegal. In 1972, the US and Soviet Union signed an anti-ballistic missile treaty that literally outlawed building missile defense systems. Each country were only allowed to have 2 sites, 2 missile defense sites, and because they realized how destabilizing these systems are. And as we've seen in the Korean Peninsula, that people have been warning about this THAAD system since last year, early last year, and look at it this year. Like, North Korea is just doing test after test, and the US and North Korea are doing threat after threat. It's definitely destabilizing the region, and it's creating a new global arms race. And this treaty was the ABM treaty, anti-ballistic missile treaty. Bush pulled the US out of the treaty in 2002, and since then the US has deployed multiple missile defense systems all around the world, to Poland, to Romania, to Guam, to Japan, in almost every single ocean around the world, and most recently in South Korea. So clearly THAAD is very controversial, and those are some of the issues and the reasons why it doesn't work. Just quickly, I just want to go over some of the Korean history. It's, when we talk about Korean Peninsula issues, we have to talk about issue. Any issue, any problem on the Korean Peninsula involves the US, it involves China, it involves Russia, it involves Japan, and even all the way down to Australia, New Zealand. All these countries will be involved. But, this Korean War is still going on since 1953. If we just let's start at the end of World War II, when the US, during World War II, Japan had colonized Korea as a whole. At the end of it, it gave the U.S. took over South Korea. The Soviets kind of had more control in the north. And in the south, the U.S. actually installed a military dictatorship. Soon they had the war, the Korean War, 1950 to 1953.
2 minutes.
Yeah. And the U.S., at the end of the war, the U.S. signed an armistice to cease fire on both sides. And it wasn't South Korea that signed it. It was China, the U.S., and North Korea that signed this armistice agreement. And part of that agreement was to withdraw all foreign troops after 90 days. And China did withdraw its troops, but the U.S. never left. The U.S. still has what's called wartime operational control in South Korea. That means if war breaks out on the peninsula, the U.S. controls the South Korean military. The main conflict is not between South Korea and North Korea. The main conflict is between the U.S. and North Korea. And since the Korean War, which completely devastated the country and killing 20% of their population, the U.S. has maintained a nuclear first strike policy against the North. And from 1958 to 1989, the U.S. had hundreds of nuclear weapons. And then at the end of the Cold War, North Korea faced an existential threat, leading them to develop nuclear weapons as a deterrence to the threat of the U.S. of a nuclear first strike policy, which the U.S. still has to this day. To sum this up, I just want to say that this is basically the U.S., the most powerful military in the world, is doing annual war games every year, multiple times a year, doing nuclear bomb dropping drills on the border of Korea. They are threatening them with nuclear first strike all the time. This is definitely a reason to be paranoid. And this is the reason why North Korea is actually building nuclear weapons. The solution, real quickly, the solution is to have a freeze for a freeze, which came about in 2015. The North proposed that they would freeze their nuclear weapons in exchange for the U.S. to freeze their annual war games and to stop threatening them with nuclear first strike. What we need to do is get the peace organizations in the U.S. to adopt this issue of freeze for a freeze. There's been a lot of disagreement on what we should do, what North Korea should do. Our options are limited, and as time goes by and after each test, our options become more limited. But right now, we know something that is clear and is a clear solution to the issues on the Korean Peninsula, and that is a freeze for a freeze. Thank you for joining me, and we'll move on to the next speaker. Thanks, all.
Thank you very much, Will. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions about the material that you covered, and hopefully we'll be able to provide people, maybe during the final comment section, with a way for people to be in touch with you. Our next speaker is Medea Benjamin, who many of you know. Medea is a co-founder of the women-led peace group Code Pink and co-founder of the human rights group Global Exchange. She's been an advocate for social justice for more than 40 years and has been described as one of the high-profile leaders of the peace movement by the LA Times, and was one of 1,000 exemplary women from 140 countries nominated to receive the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of the millions of women who have historically been at the forefront of peacemaking worldwide. In 2015, she was a delegate on the historic Women Cross DMZ Walk from North to South Korea, after which she participated in local demonstrations against the U.S.-South Korean naval base on Jeju Island. Even without her armor of pink, she's well known to all of us for her persistent and extremely forceful opposition to global U.S. militarism. Thanks, Medea, for being here.
Thank you so much, Ramsey. And I want to start out saying how impressed I am with the Korean American community that has been leading the way on these issues. And thank you for the invitation to visit South Korea. The real experts are the ones who organized this trip for us, and we are just people who have learned from them. I had an opportunity to first go to South Korea in 2009 to visit the village of Pyeongtaek, where the U.S. already had a very large military base, Camp Humphreys, but was expanding it to become the largest overseas US military base. And at the time, the village we visited was being destroyed so the US could have a golf course for the military officials. And it was heartbreaking to see the heritage, the rice fields, the beautiful houses of this village being destroyed for the sake of an expansion of US military base. I also realized that there were so many bases, US bases in South Korea, 83 of them, a massive US presence. I was able to return to South Korea with Women Cross the DMZ in 2015, where we went first to North Korea, which was very eye-opening. Aside from the fact that it's very difficult to have open discussions with people there because of the very repressive nature of the North Korean government, we did have a chance to talk to women's groups and to understand the tremendous desire for a peace treaty on the Korean Peninsula after 70 years of conflict. We also understood from the government of North Korea that their goal is not to attack outside countries, and certainly not the United States, but their goal is one of self-preservation. They wanted an end to the US provocations like the war games that we call war games, or military exercises that they see as dress rehearsals for an invasion of North Korea. They wanted a peace agreement that would be the result of the 1953 armistice that was supposed to be turned into a peace agreement, never was. And they wanted a withdrawal of US troops from the peninsula. In the meantime, I then had an opportunity to return to South Korea with this delegation in July. And it was a wonderful time to connect with, it seemed like dozens of South Korean groups that we had a chance to meet with, and going directly to the village of Sangju to meet with the villagers there was a very intense experience, because once again, we see how our government, through its billion-dollar boondoggle of this THAAD anti-missile system, is destroying the tranquility of a traditional village. But was also amazing was to see the determination of the villagers with the solidarity of Koreans from all over the country to continue their protests. Sometimes in the United States, we feel really great if we've done a protest for a week or 2 weeks. There, they do it every single day. They've already passed the 365-day mark, where they have also set up a encampment on the road that would lead up to where the THAAD is partially deployed, not finished yet. They have evening candlelight vigils in that village as well as the neighboring town. And they have every week, every Wednesday, a larger protest where people come in from different parts of the country to show their solidarity. So it really is a great model about how to be persistent and determined in ongoing protests. I think the villagers are very disheartened because when President Moon came to power on a wave of a grassroots uprising and his campaign included discussions with North Korea, he also said he was re-examining the issue of THAAD under pressure from Donald Trump, and with the recent missile tests from North Korea, he has since changed his mind and said he would give the go-ahead to complete the THAAD system. The villagers don't take that as a fait accompli. They are continuing to protest. I wanted to put this in light of what is going on now with Donald Trump. Because I think the fear in South Korea is not so much from the North, country that they have known now for quite a long time, but the unpredictability of the Trump administration. On the call, the attendees might have heard Donald Trump's comment about unleashing the fire and fury on North Korea like the world has never seen before if they threaten the United States, at which point afterwards they said they would threaten Guam and back down. there was an interview with Lindsey Graham, the senator, who said he had just talked to Donald Trump, and they agreed that there would be many, many thousands of deaths if there were a war with North Korea, but they would be over there, not over here. And today we have Donald Trump saying that talking with North Korea is not the answer. We've been talking and paying what he said were extortion payments. I think he means Peninsula. This is the opposite of what some of his cabinet members are saying, like Tillerson, Secretary of State, also like Secretary of Defense Mattis. But instead of being a strategic good cop, bad cop strategy, I think it's more a reflective of the chaos of this administration. And because of that, I think it's so dangerous that Donald Trump could blunder his way into a nuclear war with North Korea, and also use a war as a distraction from what we know are the many problems he has and will continue to have here at home. I also want to put this in the larger context. Will talked about the pivot to Asia, but when we talk about North Korea not getting nuclear weapons, let's not forget that the United States has about 6,800 nuclear warheads, and that even under the Obama administration, there was an allocation of another $1 trillion over the next 10 years to modernize the US nuclear system. And to also recognize that in the Pacific Command alone, the US has 375 personnel, over 28,000 of them based in South Korea. With bases, also US bases. I mentioned the 83 in South Korea, but also bases in neighboring Japan, Hawaii, Guam. Will talked about the war exercises. I think they're still going on right now. These are the smaller ones. The very large ones happen in March, and I think it's important for us in the anti-war movement to really try to stop the March war exercises as part of this call for a freeze. It's also important to recognize that the Trump administration has upped the sanctions, and the sanctions only hurt the North Korean people, make their lives more difficult. The Trump administration is putting tremendous pressure on the Chinese to adhere to these sanctions. The Trump administration also called for a travel ban, meaning the US citizens would not be able to travel to North Korea. It's supposed to go into effect as of September 1st. This is something else we should be working against. In terms of the kinds of things that we can do, I think we can look to the Iran nuclear deal as a model for what we want to see happening in the case of of North Korea. And in the case of Iran, there were so many different groups, not only the traditional anti-war groups, but also the humanitarian aid organizations, all kinds of anti-nuclear groups who all came together to push for the Iran nuclear deal. We need that kind of broad-based coalition to call for negotiations with North Korea. We also—
Another minute, Medea.
We also, on the positive side, have the fact that the UN just this month called for a treaty that would end all nuclear weapons, would make them illegal. The US, of course, is not party to that, but starting September 20th, nations can sign up to that, and we should push for as many nations as possible to make nuclear weapons illegal. 122 nations did agree that that's the direction that we should go in. And I also think that it's important that we look at the weapons industries, the ones who are gaining the profits from the THAAD anti-missile system and gaining the profits from the increased militarization and potential war with North Korea. That's why at Code Pink we're launching a campaign in October to call on cities and pension funds and universities, et cetera, to divest from the war industry. And the interviews that we did with South Korean women in Sangju will be part of that effort. So thank you very much.
My goodness, you get so much into such a short period of time. Thanks very much, Medea. I also want to just say that when Medea got off the airplane coming back from South Korea, I don't know how she did it, but she pulled together a rally in front of the White House within the next day or two demanding that the Trump administration stop warring on North Korea. Kind of energy and capability is incredibly valuable to our movement, and we appreciate it a great deal. Our final speaker is also well known to you. Jill Stein was the Green Party's 2016 presidential candidate and a staunch advocate for healthcare and education as human rights, a welcoming path to citizenship and demilitarization through a foreign policy based on human rights, international law, and diplomacy. She's also been at the forefront of the fight against environmental racism and injustice, and a strong proponent of local green economies and a revitalized democracy. Like Will, she protested the Dakota Access Pipeline in North Dakota, where she was arrested for standing up for clean water, human rights, and a livable climate that all of humanity depends on. What some of you may not know is that Jill is also a physician who in 2006 transitioned from clinical medicine into, as she says, quote, political medicine to help heal the mother of all illnesses, our sick political system. So we'll pass the baton to our doctor, physician friend, Jill Stein. Thanks, Jill.
Thank you so much, Ramsey, and thank you for convening this wonderful project. And I feel like I have been so honored and have learned so much from my colleagues here, from you, Ramsey, and your organization, the STIC, the Stop THAAD in Korea, and militarism in Asia and the Pacific. Long name, but a lot of substance to it, and learned so much from the South Koreans, and it's been a real incredible experience to be on this team together, which is really, it's been a bi-national team. It's been US and South Korean, both the Korean Americans who've been a part of this delegation, as well as our hosts in South Korea. And it has been extremely inspiring to learn from the people of South Korea, who, as Medea said, and others have said as well, you know, are really the leaders in this fight. And it's a fight not only to stop the THAAD anti-missile system, which is a very destabilizing, wasteful, dangerous, provocative piece of war technology, forcing the arms race into ever worse extremes. But the movement doesn't stop there. THAAD is really the beginning, and I think what I've come to learn is that THAAD is sort of the human rights struggle going on around this movement and around the crisis on the Korean Peninsula. It's a crisis which is a human rights crisis. It's a crisis of militarism. It is a crisis of occupation. It's a crisis of US empire and a foreign policy based on economic and military domination. Part of the reason I've been so interested in this crisis is not only that it is extremely urgent and potentially World War III in the making, but also because of the incredible resistance and the versatility and the resilience of the people who are leading that struggle. And again, THAAD did so much to jumpstart this struggle and to really unify the many pieces of the progressive movement in Korea, in South Korea, to create a movement which is not only about stopping THAAD, but also about stopping this basically perpetual war that was never ended. The Korean War, as was mentioned, was really ended with an armistice, but that's just sort of a it's like a peace. It's a pause in the fighting, and it's not really a secure conclusion to the war. So the people of Korea, North and South Korea, have basically been living with the continuing threat of war ever since. And the goal of the people of South Korea is not only to remove the THAAD missile system, which is provocative, which complicates the crisis in Korea, but they also want a treaty to that war, and in particular, they want an end to the war games. And it cannot be overemphasized how much the war games are extremely threatening when you have, as Will described, the what's basically a mock invasion that's being rehearsed twice a year. And in addition, there are flights of very threatening kinds of airplanes, like the B-1B bomber, which is rehearsing essentially surgical bombing strikes frequently on a monthly or even on a weekly basis. So same way that the recent ballistic missile that were shot over Japan by North Korea was extremely terrifying to Japan. You can imagine what it's like to live in North Korea, where violated by the United States, which refused to withdraw our troops. That was part of the agreement. We were supposed to withdraw our troops. That never happened. And we also brought in nuclear weapons, as one of the speakers mentioned, nuclear weapons. So we were in flagrant violation of that treaty, which was provoking North Korea. So it's basically been a series of provocations that have been, that have a decades-long history. And it's clear that where we are now, I just want to emphasize this, that where we are now is not an accident. Where we are now is essentially the culmination of a foreign policy based on economic and military domination by the US. And this isn't working. And it's going up in flames, shall we say, in many areas around the world. And that crisis has reached nuclear proportions. If you take our policies of regime change, which we practice many places around the world, particularly in the Middle East, with such devastating consequences, whether you're looking at Iraq or what's going on in Syria, this has been absolutely catastrophic. And what we've accomplished with regime change essentially has been worse terrorist threats, endless wars, which we are still stuck in, massive death and destruction. Thank you. Inordinate costs, which are bankrupting us at home as well. but we just create failed states, mass refugee migrations, and worse terrorist threats. So hasn't worked in the Middle East. Now you bring that model to the Korean Peninsula. That regime change model is complicated by the fact that we now have nuclear weapons thrown in here, and we also have great powers, that is Russia and China, who very much don't want the US on China's border. So we have no choice here, and many have said this, including James Mattis himself and others, the Secretary of Defense. We have no choice except to pursue solutions of diplomacy and ultimately of a demilitarization of the Korean Peninsula and denuclearization, or to put it another way, we need a nuclear-free, sovereign, peaceful Korean Peninsula. And we need to keep our eyes on the prize. That's the long term, and we should be reassured that there is a long-term solution here. And the first step is a simple first step. It is just that freeze that several of the speakers mentioned. It's that freeze in the war games, these war rehearsals, in exchange for a freeze on the North Korean missile and nuclear programs. And in addition to remove THAAD. So this is not difficult to do. We've actually came really close to doing it, until the war games basically went ahead and provoked the latest round of missile tests. But it should be done, and it can be done. And I'm very excited that so many people are stepping up to say that this is what we have to do, to really understand that when we join together, in fact, we are, in fact, unstoppable together, that we do have the numbers that we need, that we do have the moral authority, that we do have a series of strategic moves that actually can get us from here to there. In the absence of any viable alternative, it's very compelling to have actually a real way forward based on democracy, justice, and peace. And the last thing I want to say is that you put us together in these struggles for human rights and peace that are happening not only in Korea, that are happening in the Middle East, that are actually happening here at home, whether you're looking at the rise of right-wing extremism and white supremacy in Charlottesville, or you're looking at economic and environmental oppression as manifest in Houston, Texas now, the incredible catastrophes. It really boils down to this choice that Martin Luther King described, a choice between chaos or community. And we're seeing chaos on all these fronts right now related to a predatory system that puts profit ahead of people, planet, and peace. So if we can get together across the many fronts of peace and human rights, as well as get together across the fronts of struggle among people, planet, and peace, we have all the numbers that we need. And in addition to the solutions that others have talked about and that Medea just ran through, I want to also just remind people there is a petition. We're calling it the People's Petition for Peace that basically calls for negotiation, not escalation, and which can become, we hope, a jumping off point for this broader coalition which is out there, which the people fighting occupation, colonization, and imperialism are fighting around the world, and they are really leading the charge. So we hope to play a role in helping to support their work and helping us bring ourselves together to join into this unstoppable force that we can be the minute that we stand up together. And you can find out more about that and stay in touch with us through the stopthaad.org website. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Jill. Just in reference to your comments about Freeze for Free, to know that in the president of North Korea at the time, Kim Jong-il, offered to place a moratorium on their missile program. And that possibility fell through the cracks when, as many of you remember, Bush called North Korea a part of the evil axis and threatened nuclear attack. So it's not as if these things have not been possible in the past and can't be possible in the future. Okay, we're going to shift now for the last, and we're actually running a little late. We only have 13 minutes left. We're going to shift to a Q&A session. I just want to let everyone know, including our presenters, that we have, I would say at this point, as many as 20 or 25 questions. There is no way that we can get to them all. And so I'm going to propose that do after the webinar is we will take all of those questions, create a document with them, invite our presenters to respond to any of those that they would like to, and we will then post them on several of the websites that I'm going to show you in a minute. It's the only way that I can think of fairly handling a situation where obviously all of our presenters have generated a lot of interest and we have such limited time to get to their questions. So if our presenters would turn their cameras on and leave their audio muted until they choose to answer the question. I'm going to start with a very general question, which I think all of you probably have some thoughts about, and perhaps will be in general beneficial to everybody who is participating in the webinar. It comes from California, and the question is, based on what you learned from going to South Korea, what do you think are the role of the peace and social justice movement here in the U.S. in bringing us back from the brink of war with North Korea and resolving tensions in the Northeast Asia region? So it's really a question about what you've learned from your experiences that maybe can provide the peace and movement activists here in the States some thoughts about how we might all come together to work on this issue together. And anyone is welcome to chime in, including Julian.
Okay, I would just want to go real shortly. One thing I saw really, the organizing in South Korea is the interconnectedness of different movements, from labor unions to women movements to student movements to anti-war and peace movements, and they're all working together on several different issues, which I think is lacking here in the U.S. You got the climate movement, you got the labor movement, you got all these other movements going on, and they're not connecting the dots. They're not connecting with each other. They're not communicating with each other. So I think that's one thing that, hands down, South Korea has been doing very, very well, and that's something that we should definitely connect our social movements here in the U.S. and connect the dots together.
Thanks, Will. Any thoughts from our other presenters? Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to co-sign Will's comments. It was really nice to see, U.S. labor against the war is often kind of an outlier within the labor movement. And it was nice to see that the Korean trade union folks had an entire department dedicated to what we work on. That was pretty incredible for me, and it really gave me a lot to think about.
This is Medea.
Go ahead, Medea.
I think one of the things we have to do, even within the more progressive movement, is to tell people that the North Korean government is not crazy. That's the narrative we hear all the time, and it leads people to think you can't talk to them. It's important to really push a different narrative, which is the North Korean regime is repressive, yes. It wants to keep itself in power, and that is its number one priority when it comes to the production of these weapons. That we can talk to them. I think it's important that, Ramsey, you gave the example in 2000. It's also important to recognize that during the Clinton years, there were lots of talks which slowed down the whole nuclear program. And there was also a time when the US agreed to stop the war exercises. So while this is portrayed by the US right as examples of how you can't talk to North Korea. I think we have to give examples that you can talk to North Korea. And in fact, you must talk to North Korea because there is no alternative.
And I'll just add real quick that the determination of the South Korean movement, called the Candlelight movement, was really powerful. And they went from impeaching a president, a corrupt conservative president, to turning their attention then to THAAD. And their courage and their conviction should be an inspiration to us. And I think it is an inspiration. And I also just would remind people that back in 2013, when the US and Obama were threatening Syria, they were threatening to do a first bombing campaign against Syria. We stood up as a peace movement, and they told us resistance was futile and forget it, don't even try. But we stood up and we made it impossible. And I think it's really important to recognize that we have a lot of numbers out there, and that this is a very devastating problem if allowed to continue on the course that it's on. So again, just taking a lesson from the very courageous Korean people, the people of South Korea, could go a long way to help us use that power. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jill. I'm going to choose another question that actually came in particularly for Reese, although others may have something to say about this as well. It comes from Freeport, Maine, and the question is, could you say again the part about workers not necessarily willing to be part of the military-industrial complex, not willing workers? It's a vital concept for me, especially living near a shipyard. Pretty soon it feels as if there isn't going to be any other job in the US except military.
Yeah, so this is something I end up with a lot. There's a reality that we aren't really willing to acknowledge. You know, the reason we're able to sell weapons of war is because of us as taxpayers, right? Like we fund those arms sales, and it's a subsidy program is what it actually really is. When business is good, we rationalize bigger purchases even when we don't need them, and when business isn't as good, we give them away or we sell them to governments we claim to despise. And you know, the plans for spending are made years in advance, and it becomes this cycle where workers are trapped. And there's a longer political game that we could talk about, and I'll definitely contribute to a document and write a little bit more about it. So briefly, I just want to say, I know a lot of folks had questions about what can labor do, and you know, how do we face this, and it all feels so big. The reality is that it's not just about complicity, right? It's about a kind of acceptance. We have to face the fact as folks that work, that there's a bigger challenge, and that's about talking to folks who are trapped in this cycle and the system. We found in U.S. Labor Against the War that it's not just about having a pitch or a rap, right? It's about listening to people. The reality is that a lot of folks feel like they don't have any other options or any choices, like you were saying. So we have to work with local communities to figure out some solutions. It's going to take some time. It's going to take some effort. But what was interesting is that this is an international problem now, right? The really great government official we actually spoke to identified that he had a similar problem when he was trying to shut down a nuclear power plant in the communities that he serves. And so the workers were the people who showed up to push back against that. So this is a thing that we're seeing in other places as well, a phenomenon we're seeing in other places as well. And it's really about communities that are isolated and not really a part of the economic system or cycle. We can have more conversations about this. I'd be happy to contact you offline about some methodologies that we've been employing to try and reach these workers and build these better relationships. But it's a process. It's been a process that's been going on for decades to create. So it's going to take us a little time to unravel it, but we can and we will do so.
Thanks very much, Reese. Unfortunately, we are very quickly coming to the end of our time. As I said before, a lot of these questions that you sent in are really important and terrific. We'll definitely make an effort to get to all of them and make them available to you through some of the websites that I'm going to ask Sarah to put up in a short moment. One of the other questions was from somebody who said, what can we read? Korea seems to be such a complicated issue and with a very complicated history. Some of the websites that we're going to put up in a moment will provide you with some of what we consider to be the best resources for different perspectives on current issues facing the US-Korea relation and also some of the history. And I'll also personally simply recommend two books, one by Bruce Cummings called Korea's Place in the Sun, and another short book by him called The Korean War. Sarah, if you could put those two slides up that will provide people with websites that they can go to for additional information. Following this slide, which will be up for another maybe 15 or 20 seconds, so you can copy the links if you like. We're also going to show you a link to the petition that Jill mentioned in her comments. We already have probably close to 6,000 signatures from people in Korea, the United States, and other parts of the world. And we participation by going to the link and adding your name to the petition. There's the petition information. Okay. We were planning to have a final comment from each of our speakers before closing out, but we are within 2 minutes of our closing. Can I ask each of our presenters if it's possible in 1 or 2 sentences to leave us with any thoughts that you might have, either from your experience or from our conversation this evening? And then I'll have a final word to say.
I can say something quickly. This is Medea.
Thanks.
In this case, we are fortunate to have two communities that we can look to follow their lead, and that is the very vibrant civil society within South Korea and the progressive Korean American community. So let's let them lead us, and we have to be in solidarity.
I think that speaks for us all.
See, this is a delegation that works so closely together. You all can speak for each other. That's terrific. Okay, we're going to close out. We will shortly be adding a recording of this webinar to the STIC website, Stop Sad in Korea. I think if you go there, maybe in the next day or so, you'll be able to pick it up. We hope you will share it widely with your networks. One of our members has also done interviews with each of the delegates, and those interviews will also be put up on the STIC website as well as the Korea Policy Institute website. We hope again that you'll let your friends know about those particular resources as well. I want to thank all of you, and I believe there were almost 150 of you who participated as attendees for this evening's webinar. And thank again our delegates and speakers, and leave you with one thought. Remember, Korea was once and will again be one. Thank you all, and good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks, folks. Sarah, can you get us back to the green room?